Looped slideshow. On backgrounds of warm yellow, vivid sky blue and soft red, credits for this panel are shared. Each new slide features a large white text box with black text and a bold black outline of a geometric shape, circles, triangles and parallelograms. First slide on yellow, text reads, "From Access to Inclusion, an Arts and Culture Summit." Next slide. Text reads, "Welcome to the People with Disabilities Leading Change Panel." Find out more by visiting adiarts.ie/summit and kennedy-center.org, with centre spelt CENTER. Next slide. Text reads, "Meet our chair, Beth Zebarth, Director, Access Smithsonian Institution." A photograph of Beth, a woman with blonde shoulder-length hair pinned back, wearing clear-rimmed glasses. Beth wears a grey jacket, wine silk top and chunky necklace. She sits in a bright, airy sitting room and speaks with an American accent. Next slide. Text reads, "Meet our presenters, Ray Bloomer, Accessibility Specialist, U.S. National Park Service." A photograph of Ray, a man with long grey hair swept back into a ponytail. Ray wears a pale green shirt and striped tie. He sits in front of drawn curtains which are dark and heavy and patterned with leaves of different colours. He has an American accent. Next slide. Text reads, "Morwenna Collette, Arts, Access and Inclusion Consultant." A photograph of Morwenna, a woman with long fair hair in a low ponytail. Morwenna smiles warmly in this image. She wears dark-rimmed glasses and a rust-red blouse with circle pattern, which contrasts with the pale grey walls of the room. Morwenna has an Australian accent. Next slide. Text reads, "Alicia McGivern, Head of Education, Irish Film Institute." A photograph of Alicia sitting in a room with butter yellow walls. Alicia has short brown hair with a long fringe and dark-rimmed glasses. Alicia wears a wine roll-neck jumper with a heavy silver pendant around her neck. She has an Irish accent. Next slide. Text reads, "Pádraig Naughton, Executive Director, Arts and Disability Ireland." A photograph of Pádraig, a man with fair complexion and dark hair with flecks of grey, with a slight fringe covering his forehead. He wears a pale grey shirt and dark tie. Pádraig sits on a dark leather couch with cream throw cushions. He has an Irish accent. Next slide. Text reads, "Access services available today. Irish Sign Language Interpretation, British Sign Language Interpretation, American Sign Language Interpretation," with the associated logo for sign language, 2 hands, both forming a circle by pressing thumb and forefinger together. Also, speech to text, brackets CART, with the associated logo, a rectangular speech bubble with 3 horizontal lines in it. Next slide. Text reads, "Screen layout." A large frame is in the centre, where the main speaker will be live streamed during the panel. In this slide, Betty Siegel's image is here. There are 4 more images in each corner of the slide. In the top left-hand corner is the logo from Access to Inclusion. In the top right-hand corner is a still image of Lisa Harvey, the ISL interpreter, standing before a blue background. In the bottom right-hand corner is Sally Gillespie, the BSL interpreter. She too stands before a blue screen. The last image in the bottom left-hand corner is of Sharon Ploger, the ASL interpreter. Sharon sits before a black screen. A line of text at the bottom of the slide reads, "Speech to text, CART," will be visible here. Next slide. Text reads, "For tech support, use the chat feature at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, or please email sile@adiarts.ie or support at eventcube.io. Next slide. Text reads, Audience Q&A. We want to hear from you. Please submit your questions throughout this session in the Q&A box underneath this video. The Submit Your Question field has been clearly labelled for screen readers. This question field is located beneath this video. Next slide. The From Access to Inclusion logo on our left. On our right, the text Starting Soon, with a reminder of the social media details, each typed as one word. Facebook account, Arts and Disability Ireland. Twitter account, ADI Arts. And Instagram account, Arts and Disability Ireland. Hashtag Access Summit.
Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion on People with Disabilities Leading Change. My name is Beth Zebarth, and I'm a disabled person serving as Director of Access Smithsonian at the Smithsonian Institution. The following quote by Stephen Brown, a historian and disability scholar, touches on critical aspects of our discussion today. People with disabilities have forged a group identity. We share a common history of oppression and a common bond of resilience. We generate art, music, literature, and other expressions of our lives and our culture, infused from our experience of disability. Most importantly, we're proud of ourselves as people with disabilities. We claim our disabilities with pride as part of our identity. Arts and cultural organizations must embrace disability as part of their diversity, equity, and inclusion responsibilities and strategies. We need to articulate the difference between accessibility, the functional limitations imposed by poorly designed environments, and the systemic discrimination against disabled people. We need leaders with disabilities who unite with allies to ensure our human rights to participate in arts and culture. This panel reflects on leadership roles and opportunities for people with disabilities and poses a closing question. Where do we go from here? How do we address diversity and inclusion of people with disabilities in leadership in arts and cultural organizations and institutions? And how can we remove the barriers to leadership and the workforce in general? Our panelists have the skills, knowledge, lived experience, and creativity born from making inaccessible environments work for them and other people with disabilities that shape the future of inclusion, representation, and upward mobility of disabled people in the cultural arts. Our panel will offer their varied experiences of becoming a leader within arts and culture organizations or institutions. These leaders have all been part of driving change in arts, culture, and disability, and are leading by example on a national and international stage. Our panelists include Moena Collett, Arts Access and Inclusion Consultant, Alicia McGivern, Head of Education at the Irish Film Institute, Padraig Naughton, Executive Director of Arts and Disability Ireland, and Ray Bloomer, Accessibility Specialist at the National Park Service. Ray, I invite you to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Beth. And I'm really excited to be a member of this panel, People with Disabilities, and the opportunity to talk about how change has come about over time. I began my career in this field 45 years ago with the United States National Park Service. I began as an interpretive ranger giving tours of Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia at Independence National Historic Park. When actually my career, I found out how my career really started about 15 years ago. A friend of mine met the person at a conference who actually hired me. And she told me I almost didn't get this job. She said that when she interviewed me, I aced the interview. I was everything that she was hoping for interpretive staff people to be at Independence National Park, except she just could not imagine how a blind person could possibly do this job. She told me that she would let me know in 2 weeks what the outcome of the interview was as far as whether I'd get the job or not. So I thanked her and I left. And she said that she looked down at her desk a minute or two later and she saw my hat sitting there. So she grabbed the hat, ran down the hallway, no Ray Bloomer. She went downstairs, couldn't find me, checked with the receptionist who said that I had just gone out the door, but she didn't know what direction I went in. So the person, Kathy, the person that interviewed me, went out the door, picked a direction, went about 3 blocks before she caught up with me and gave me back my hat. And on her way back to her office, she figured if I can get that far away from her in such a short amount of time, I could probably do that job. But this is where equity did not exist at that time, even far less than it does today. Other people didn't have to prove how quick on their feet they were. So when I say all that, I talk about one of the things that I did when I first began with the National Park Service, working at the Liberty Bell. I saw how my colleagues were treating our visitors with disabilities. They didn't know what to say to them. They didn't know how to render assistance, how to make an equal experience for them, no matter what their disability was. And I began looking and doing some research, looking into what can I do to make this a little bit better for the visitor, but also better for my fellow rangers. So I put together a training program, offered it to management, and they really liked the idea, and it made our rangers much more comfortable. From that point, I also got a job offer at another park in Boston National Historic Park, because it was a relatively new park and they wanted to really start to address the disability issues and accessibility as they developed. I spent 3 years in Boston National Historic Park doing a lot of training and being involved in planning, but it also got me involved with the North Atlantic region, which at that time consisted of 26 parks. I continued to do a lot more disability awareness training, but I managed to get on some planning teams, which included the Statue of Liberty restoration project. Not only did I work with the National Park Service, but because this was a void that existed not only throughout the National Park Service, but throughout the museum and the cultural arts field. So I got invited to other conferences throughout Boston and throughout the United States to be involved with disability training, to talk about planning, how do you get involved, and so on. It was not only doing disability awareness, but I also was invited to be involved in the development of standard setting agencies such as our U.S. Access Board. And then from there, it kind of morphed into being involved with exhibit development, operation planning, along with other aspects of the operations that existed within national parks. Much of this came before laws. We sort of started off with, this was a pretty good idea that we needed to convince management that they had to do. From there, we did develop some laws and regulations, but it was also convincing management that there was an audience of people with disabilities, and that people with disabilities didn't want to be just looked at as people with disabilities, but they wanted to be looked at as members of a family unit, whether they were the parents or the children or the grandparents, but that they were also members of school units, members of social groups, and not just a person with a disability. So they wanted that kind of an opportunity. But what was important for me was, as a person with a disability, it was really important for me to be able to ensure that I was not just speaking from my point of view, that I was speaking in particular, not just as Ray Bloomer, who happens to have a particular visual impairment, and someone who was adventitiously blind. I did not become blind until I was 17, but that I could speak across the board about all people with low vision or visual impairments, and that I also had to learn about other disabilities and the breadth of those disabilities, because it is very important to realize that there's a perception that many people have, and that is, if you have a disability, then you know everything about people with disabilities. And I had to make sure that I had that capability because that expectation was there. So I had to make sure that I was as knowledgeable about many other people with disabilities. I also became chief ranger at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, which was the home of former President Theodore Roosevelt, which was really important for me throughout the rest of my career, because having been a manager of an interpretive operation, when I went to other parks and I went to other meetings and I was at the table talking about accessibility, about different operations, people knew that I sat in their seat before, that it wasn't just a person who happens to be blind that was giving an opinion or sharing expertise, but that I also had the experience as a fellow manager and understood the types of issues that they were raising when we went through that different kinds of planning methods or opportunities that were available. So when we go back and I talked about how it was started, it was originally, when I first began in the mid 70s and the early 80s, it was accessibility was just a good idea. Then a little bit later, we started to have some regulations, and accessibility was a legal obligation. But we also had to make sure that people understood how to implement that legal obligation, but to turn that a little bit more towards something that Beth said in her introduction, and that is inclusion. And that came about through the implementation of the principles of universal design to a very high degree. We needed to make sure that when we were working with exhibit developers and managers, that they understood what universal design meant. One of the early examples of this was, as I mentioned, my work with the Statue of Liberty restoration project. But in 2013, I was involved with another exhibit design group that worked on the development of the White House Visitor Center in Washington, D.C. Throughout that development, what we actually did was to look at every single element that went into that exhibit. And we had to answer the question, can all people with disabilities gain the benefits of and participate in each component, whether it was the introductory film, whether it was orientation to the exhibit itself, or all of the different components throughout the different phases of the exhibition. And we made sure that it was tactile. We made sure that communication took place at all different levels. So no matter what one's ability to hear or see what type of information was provided, that it was available to everyone, that everything that was there was reachable, and that you could operate it all from a seated or standing position, and that everyone, whether seated or standing, could see and read all of that information, that each message was provided. On the grand opening day, what really let me know that we hit the mark was when former First Lady Michelle Obama said, "This is really great. Look at how much fun it's going to be for kids. There's so many tactile and hands-on things available here." A couple years later, I also had a chance to work with another major exhibit project that we had in the National Park Service, and that was the Arch at Gateway, or the Arch Museum at Gateway Arch National Park in St. Louis. And that was where we were interpreting Western expansion within the United States. And that museum right now probably has more tactile pieces in it than any other museum I am aware of within the National Park Service. But again, we considered every single disability, and we considered all of the different components and messages and the different experiences that we wanted people we had. And we wanted to make sure that everyone gained those experiences. On the grand opening day, with a colleague, I was walking through the museum, and I happened to have run into the superintendent. And I asked him, did he feel satisfied with what he's seeing with all of the visitors going to each of the different exhibits? And he said, I am absolutely shocked at how much people are engaged with the exhibits. He said, not just the accessibility, but I'm seeing all visitors engaged with their family and friends. It used to be people just looked and moved on, looked and moved on. He says, but they're actually looking at the exhibits, and because there's so much hands-on, everybody, whether they have a disability or not, are experiencing each of the exhibits together. And based on that, it really let me know that a lifetime of experience or a lifetime of working within this field really has not been in vain. It really has given people that were engaged in the development process of places like Statue of Liberty, the White House Visitor Center, and the Gateway Arch. And it was successful, not only because people with disabilities as visitors were having an equitable experience, but that those individuals that were a part of the development process learned a lot, and they will take their experiences on to the many other projects that they will work on in the future. So in that sense, when we ask that question of where do we go from here, on to the very next project. Thank you very much. And now I would like to pass it over to our next panelist, Morwenna.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thanks so much to Arts and Disability Ireland for having me join this important conversation today with some wonderful colleagues and sector leaders. As Beth said at the beginning, my name's Morwenna, and I'm a disabled musician and arts consultant specialising in diversity, access and inclusion. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. And today I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional First Peoples land where sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Similarly to many other countries, Australia's approach to diversity and inclusion within the arts is improving, but we've still got a long way to go. And I think when it comes to diversity, disability is kind of often the poor cousin, with other areas such as gender and race often taking precedence in organisational thinking and programs. And unfortunately here in Australia, we don't have anything quite like England's Equalities Act. So there's nothing really spelling out for us exactly what it is that we mean when we say the word diversity. I do look to the UK a lot, and I'm envious not just of that Equalities Act, but also things like Arts Council England's commitment to diversity, including their reporting, covering areas such as just how many disabled people are leading organisations across things like their National Portfolio Organisation suite. I think that information is power, and here in Australia we really lack this sort of knowledge currently and need to get better at capturing this sort of data, as information is part of what leads to change. What we do know here is that only 9% of Australian artists identify as disabled, whereas nearly 20% of our general population does. We also know that sadly Australian disabled artists earn 42% less than their counterparts without disability. We also know that many of our disabled leaders are doing great work in the arts and disability space, but not so many are leading non-disability specific organisations. So it's kind of like our lived experience doesn't seem to be translating across to the non-disabled world. Across 2014-2015, about 25 Australian disabled leaders went through the SYNC leadership program run by UK-based Jo Verrett and Sarah Pickthall. Now, some of these individuals have gone on to run disability organisations or projects since, but to my knowledge, none have yet held senior leadership positions in mainstream arts organisations. And why is this? Now, I know that being a leader isn't only something you can do by running an organisation. There's other ways to influence, advocate, and create positive change. But I do wonder, what is it that's holding disabled people back from making significant leadership contributions across the entire arts sector, rather than being ghettoised and pigeonholed in arts and disability work only? Another thing that I find puzzling is how many of our arts and disability organisations are not disability-led, and how many access and inclusion-related job positions across our sector are not filled by disabled people. Now, of course, disabled people don't only have to work in arts and disability-related jobs, but I still find this curious. And I think when you compare it here to First Nations organisations, the majority of them are led by First Nations Australians. So again, why is disability different? When I think back on my own career in the arts, there are a number of things that have helped me as a disabled person in my journey to now be doing significant leadership work that I enjoy. And these are gathering support from great mentors and work colleagues, moving around quite a few different roles and organisations to gather a wide range of experience, creating my own intern and secondment opportunities to work with other organisations nationally and internationally, continuous learning and study, networking, and applying for grant funding to create my own work opportunities. So to come back to the panel's provocation of where do we go from here in terms of creating more leadership opportunities for disabled people, I'd like to address this by sharing 3 recommendations for arts and cultural organisations, and then 3 recommendations for emerging disabled leaders. So, what should arts and cultural organisations be doing to address diversity and inclusion for people with disabilities in leadership positions? Well, first up, I think we need to understand the true value that diversity brings an organisation and put it firmly on the agenda. There are many different reasons why organisations are interested in diversity. I think the most common are the moral imperative, because people think it's the right thing to do, and also because of funding or legislative requirements. And I really encourage organisations to also consider the artistic benefits that diversity brings, as well as the business case and economic benefits. If your venue is more accessible, you're going to be able to sell more tickets. For my second recommendation to organisations, I'm borrowing some words from the incredible Australian disabled leader, Carolyn Bowditch. Organisations need to make space for people from diverse backgrounds, including disabled people. Here in Australia, in the last few years, we've had 2 non-disabled leaders of arts and disability organisations step down from their positions as they believed a disabled person should be running their organisation. And they made this happen by getting out of the way. I think we can also make space by creating targeted positions specifically to be filled by people from diverse backgrounds. And lastly, my third recommendation for organisations is that those in positions of power and privilege need to check their biases. We all have some level of unconscious bias, and many people want to work with people similar to themselves. We need to name this and to bring it to our attention. Does a job applicant really need to have a university degree to perform a role? This is something that's so often listed as an essential criteria in many job ads, but is it really necessary for every job? I'm conscious that as someone with an invisible impairment, I've benefited from being able to pass as non-disabled, and I'm acutely aware of the positive career outcomes that this has provided me. So let's make sure we name and confront our biases and don't make assumptions about what someone can and can't do. And now some words to our emerging and aspiring disabled leaders joining us today. You are the future, and you have so many important things to contribute to our sector. And I have 3 suggestions for you. To borrow again from Carolyn Bowditch, we as disabled leaders need to take space. We need to dream big and be bold, be visible in our aspirations and tell people what we want. We know that up to 85% of jobs are filled by networking, not by submitting job applications. Make sure your colleagues and your networks know what it is that you're working towards or seeking. If people don't know you're interested, how can they directly invite you to take up an opportunity when it comes along? Number 2, in a world that isn't designed for us, it's important to make our own opportunities. Seek out opportunities to learn, develop and progress, identify gaps and make a plan for how we can address these. I have a dream here to increase the inclusivity of Australia's music industry and have recently created a partnership with several music service organisations across the country. I've successfully applied for some funding and have created my own job for the next few months, scoping out a national music venue accreditation scheme. I'm a firm believer that we must seek out and create our own opportunities. And finally, we should all build a strong support system around us, whether it's through family, friends, pets, eating and sleeping well or exercising, working with a mentor, having time to yourself to recharge, whatever that looks like for you. We need to take care of our physical, emotional and mental health, particularly during the strained times we find ourselves living in. Understand what it is to function at your best and make sure that this is prioritised. So as we all come to terms with what life living with COVID-19 is like and settle into our new reality, I think we each have an opportunity to think differently. Arts organisations perhaps have more time and space to reflect, adjust and change. We know we don't want to go back to the way we were before. We need to work together to re-emerge as a more inclusive, accessible and resilient sector. No matter what role you play in the arts and cultural sector, we all have the ability and responsibility to make change. And hopefully our panel today gives you some ideas about how you can help make that happen. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to hand over to our next presenter, Alicia McGibbon, to begin her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Morwenna, and hello everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this estimable panel as part of the Arts Disability Ireland Summit. I'm going to talk about our accessible cinema programme at the Irish Film Institute and my involvement in that. I wanted to start with a quote from an audience member who was invited to give feedback to one of our accessible screenings. She said, "It's wonderful to just sit here in company with an audience and share an experience." In many ways, this quote encompasses both my own personal interests, but also my motivation for working in accessibility. First, a little bit of background for those of you who may not know our organisation. The Irish Film Institute is Ireland's National Cultural Institute for Film. We have 3 cinema screens, the IFI Irish Film Archive, a shop and a cafe bar. The Institute was founded in 1945 and since 1992 has been housed in an 18th century Quaker building, Quaker meeting house in the centre of Dublin. It's a buzzy, lively place, welcoming over 200,000 visitors annually. We show over 5,000 screenings in-house, ranging from art house cinema to independent to Irish to classic and archive material. I've led the education programme at the IFI for over 20 years. I have a teaching background, having taught overseas for a number of years before coming back to Ireland. And tracing a common thread back through my career, I can say that providing access and opportunities to engage has always been at the heart of it, either with language of literature and film in the classroom or with our various audiences at IFI. In terms of driving accessible cinema at IFI, I would say there's 2 significant markers for me. I started to lose my hearing around 2010, progressing to total bilateral hearing loss and deafness in 2017 when I got a cochlear implant. Coincidentally, or some people might say this was destiny, cinema began to move to digital projection around about 2012, meaning that projection was no longer on reels, but delivered in digital files. What this meant was that providing extra features such as captions or audio description became a real possibility. And so the concept of an accessible cinema programme, beyond just the physical standards of the building, could actually come into being. I want to step back there and speak just a little bit about disability and the cinema from my own experience, but also considering the practicalities that remove cinema from the experience of so many people. Perhaps some of the 13.5% of the population in Ireland who live with disability, according to the most recent census. As everyone here knows, cinema is an art form that communicates through sound and vision. We share the experience of suspending time and space in a darkened room. We lose ourselves in stories unfolding on screen, with our emotions engaged in ways that few other art forms can achieve. Stories on screen can move us to laugh, cry, get angry, to protest, to be terrified, to be transcendent through their sights and sounds. Yet for the person who's blind or deaf, vision impaired or hard of hearing, these experiences can be almost entirely out of reach. Over the years of losing my hearing, cinema ebbed further and further away from me. First the music soundtrack, then the sound effects, and ultimately the dialogue. To reach back to that quote I gave you at the start, no longer could I sit with an audience and enjoy an experience. Instead, it became an experience that filled me with anger, sadness, and fear. But slowly, however, it also filled me with determination to explore the possibilities for making our program at IFI more accessible. As an educator, I'm motivated to develop audiences, to reach out to people who may not have ready access to cultural cinema or a cultural venue. I want to encourage audiences to engage with cinema critically, to foster amongst young people film and media literacy skills, to raise awareness of the vast choice of film that's outside the mainstream, to promote cultural capital in our city and around the country. For me, as a deaf person who loves cinema, I'm motivated to expand our audience reach to include audiences with disability and to convince them, most importantly, that they can enjoy this rich art form again. Accessibility in the context of cinema can include addressing the physical building through a building audit, determining whether it's wheelchair accessible on all floors. It requires addressing the format of films being shown, whether captions or audio description can be made available, if extra equipment is required, such as headphones, or whether relaxed conditions should be offered. Marketing and communication materials need reviewing. Staff development and disability equality training are required so that the venue is a welcoming and inclusive place for all. To start the pilot accessible program at IFI back in 2016, developed in collaboration with Arts Disability Ireland and with the support of the Arts Council of Ireland, we had to address all of those areas. Like the business of filmmaking itself, delivering a cinema or indeed any arts program is very much a collaborative effort, requiring input and commitment across several areas of an organisation. So for IFI, this includes projection, cinema programming, front of house, operations, marketing and communications, and management. A project leader needs to see all these aspects and pull them together and convince colleagues and the organisation that it's actually something that's worth doing. From a cinema point of view, success is measured typically in box office terms. So let's take a hugely successful film such as La La Land. This was during our pilot project from 2018. It showed in the IFI to over 5,000 people. Of this number, just 1.12% attended the open caption screening. And some might conclude from that that's not actually worth doing. But it's important to note that of the total number of screenings offered of the film, just 2 had open captions, 1 matinee and 1 evening show. Together, they yielded 64 people. This doesn't include audiences who are availing of audio description, which is accessible on all shows through the use of a headset in our venue. What 1.12% does not reveal is the experience of attendees for whom captions enabled them share the experience of cinema, or as one person said, enjoy the film just like everybody else. The job of a leader is to build on those audience experiences, convince people that the organisation is committed to the accessible endeavour and is not just ticking a box with a couple of shows. At the same time, a leader must convince the organisation that something is worth doing. In the pilot project, we learned that it wasn't simply a matter of if you build it, they will come. Very often they won't. Through the surveys and focus groups, we learned much more about audiences with disability and their experience of the arts. We heard how some had given up on cinema or other art forms altogether. Significantly, we got some insight into what might entice people to engage again. It's important also to mention the impact of representation on screen and how cinema has depicted, for example, characters who are blind or deaf in such negative or stereotypical ways. More often than not, a character is defined by their disability. Even a recent film many people will know, such as A Quiet Place, where the young daughter has a cochlear implant. It's her deafness versus the other character's hearing ability that's actually the main focus of the film. All of these elements contribute to distance people with disability from engaging with the arts. So it's the role of cultural leaders to ensure that not only are the building and the facilities accessible, but also that the content of a cultural program is diverse and inclusive in terms of the stories that are being told. When we completed our pilot project in 2018, we offered some best practice guidelines, which we'd pulled together from the 3 previous years. Of these, I think the most significant one concerns the audience. That the audience for accessible cinema is the audience. It's not the audience who are deaf or blind or wheelchair users, but they belong to the cinema audience, just have different needs. Now, as we hopefully plan to progress out of the pandemic, I hope that this view will inform our strategy as we work together to bring our audience back. The main challenge for all the arts now is how to win back audiences, how to convince people to come back to the cinema or the theatre or the music venue and to feel safe again. Over the past year, so much has been about survival of organisations that the Accessible Project at IFI has fallen from view. It's the challenge for leaders to bring accessibility to the forefront and to ensure that all organisations post-pandemic aim for a great reset, where arts and culture are central to our societies and diversity and inclusion are integral to that. Tucked away for months on end in our own individual darkened rooms, we've lost the shared and real experience of the arts. Let's hope that there's a great hunger out there to experience this again. I know at the moment it's hard to think of COVID gain, unless you're talking about our waistlines, but the pandemic has given us an opportunity to seize the momentum of reopening and to rebuild our organisations with everybody in mind. Thank you, and I'd like to hand over now to Padraig Naughton.
Thank you, Alicia. I suppose for me, I never really thought of myself as a leader or wanting to be a leader. In fact, I almost think of myself as an accidental leader. And in some ways, I think my career turning points or paths or changes in direction have been as a result of some level of frustration or wanting to do something a bit different. So when I was young and in secondary school in the 1980s, what I found was that the career paths I was being encouraged to pursue as a visually impaired person were things like physiotherapy, telephony, piano tuning, basket weaving. They were, I suppose, the set careers that many blind and visually impaired people had done before. And I don't think I do think telephony terrified me. I just didn't want to be a telephonist. Can't quite explain why. I just didn't want to be one. But I think more than anything, I wanted, like most young people, non-disabled or disabled, to go do my own thing. And the one thing I loved in school was art. Some people reckoned I was reasonably good at it. And so I decided I'd become an artist, and I took myself off to the National College of Art and Design in 1989, and I studied for a degree in craft design. I also think deep down, though, I wanted to get away from special school, and I did want to be normal. I didn't want to be visually impaired. However, I very quickly realised that in fact I was on a visual design course. And while I really was studying craft design ceramics because I love clay, it was a visual design course. And I had to find a way of reconciling that with my visual impairment. And in fact, I couldn't walk away from my visual impairment. But there are many things you do when you're young and naive. And that was one of the things I tried to do. So I suppose what happened during my time in art college was I did start to recognize that the reason I loved clay was because I loved handling the material. And while the course was a visual design course, there were ways I could adapt and make that suited my visual impairment. And of course, what that did was to open up a dialogue with my peers and with my tutors around how I actually saw the world. But of course, as most people know, that actually figuring out yourself and how you articulate that is a difficult process, and it actually takes time. However, I suppose what it really did for me was it led me into the area of advocacy, because I suppose over time and after my degree particularly, I became recognized as this visual artist with a visual impairment, which back in the 1990s was kind of a strange combination. There weren't that many of us about. And I had many artist residencies. I had a studio practice. I moved between Ireland and the UK, working for the Richard Attenborough Centre as artist in residence. I did a PGCE, which is art and design secondary school teaching qualification at Bretton Hall in West Yorkshire. And as I say, I had my studio career. But over that time, I found myself more and more being drawn into comment on this consultation, sit on that panel, contribute to some publication. And it kind of all revolved around my role as an artist with a disability. And that started to occupy more and more of my time. However, I found myself being what we might call in Ireland a hurler on the ditch, or somebody commenting from the sidelines, because what I found was, while my opinions were heard, I couldn't really make sure that they were implemented. And that led me to in 2003 to make a very conscious decision. That was the European Year of People with Disabilities. And I'll always remember it because I remember taking a phone call from a lady, a very nice lady. I spent about an hour and a half giving her advice around her project that she was doing. And I said to her at the end of it, and by the way, if you're looking for an artist with a disability, I might be, consider me. And to which I was told, oh, well, you're not from this county, so we wouldn't be able to involve you. I kind of thought, well, if I'm giving away this expertise for free, I might as well try and get paid for it. And so I ended up moving to the UK to work for Equata, the Disability Arts Development Agency for South West England. But I think during my time in the UK, I very much wanted to come back to Ireland and really make change in an Irish context. And that was always really important to me. While I was in the UK, I saw audio description at the London Disability Film Festival for the first time. And I thought this was amazing. I saw the old Todd Browning film, Freaks. Alicia might remember that one. It's 1932, one of the first talkies as described. And there were two screens of text at the very beginning, and the audio describer read them. And I cried because I don't think I ever heard anybody read what was on the screen to me before. And it was a revelation. And I thought, if I ever get back to Ireland, I'm going to start audio description. And in 2005, I came back to take on the role of Executive Director of Arts and Disability Ireland. And obviously, there were a number of arts and disability projects that I took on immediately because they were part of ADI's bread and butter. There was a dance project and a drama project, but I said to the board, will you please allow me start audio description? And in 2006, we started our very first audio described show. We did at the Abbey, Ireland's National Theatre. That led on to working with Dublin Theatre Festival, and eventually loads of venues around the country, including taking a whole lot of shows on that went on tour and making them accessible, not just with audio description, because after adding audio description at the Abbey, we went on to add captioning, and then we started to work with venues and festivals both in Dublin and further afield. And, you know, as my role as Executive Director, we say that Arts and Disability Ireland champions the creativity of artists with disabilities, and we promote inclusive experiences for audiences with disabilities. And I suppose that role in terms of access is so important to me. As I say, it was one of my motivations for wanting to come back to Ireland and take the experience I'd learned and seen in the UK and make it happen in my own country. And I suppose, you know, in my time with Arts and Disability Ireland, I'll always see starting audio description and captioning and the other access services that we do as one of my greatest successes as Executive Director. But strangely, I'll also see it as one of my biggest disappointments. And I suppose this is something in terms of leadership that you don't see in the early years, is how long change takes to happen. And by disappointment, I mean, and Alicia touched on it, she said, you know, we think if we build it, they will come. I almost thought that if we created audio description, we created captioning, and we did it with a number of venues, that more and more venues would get interested and more audiences would come. But actually, it's a very, very slow process. And I often say to people who come and work with Arts and Disability Ireland, sometimes you can't measure change in months or even years. Sometimes you have to measure it in decades. I know I'm beginning to sound very old, but there you go. I suppose another thing that's really struck me about the notion of build it and they will come is that actually, you know, at an operational level, that's very much what we do. Arts and Disability Ireland rolls out access services and the many other things we do, which I'm not going to talk about today. And we do build a cohort of audiences and partnerships and advocates who want to see the services happen. But I suppose what I've become very conscious of in more recent times is that we do need to see policy change, and we do need to move to that point where it's not just individuals who are fighting for the change or visioning the change and showing it to people, but actually it needs to be embedded in policy. And in fact, it's for that reason I've made another change in my own life recently, in that I've started a part-time LLM, which is a master's in law. The term terrifies me, but in fact it's in international and comparative disability law and policy. Because again, what I've understood in my career is that I've reached this kind of crossroads again, where, like when I couldn't change things, as an artist, I became an arts administrator. And then I suppose, yes, I did lead change at an operational level, but I'm now finding that I need to understand policy. And for me, one way to understand it was through the LLM. And I hope over time that I can better, by understanding the nuts and bolts of policy and what's under the hood, then actually I can better shape future policy. And I suppose that for me is a really important thing to learn and to realize, is that as we move through our careers, and I think both Ray and Moena and Alicia have all touched on it, is that there are people who come after us, and what we're trying to do is make their job easier, but also to say to them, actually, we were there, we understand that, and actually what we're now trying to do is shape the next level so that when you come after us, you actually don't have all that heavy lifting to do, and you can take things further than we actually did. I suppose one last thing I just want to touch on, which is, I think in some ways is partly coming out of the pandemic, but it's been a trend before the pandemic. And I suppose this takes me back to my operational thinking, is around standards in access. One of the things that I suppose the pandemic has showed as we've moved to digital is that not everything that's moved to the digital space in the arts and cultural sector has been accessible to people with disabilities. We're still in an Irish context waiting to see audio description appear in digital content in the arts and cultural sector. And I'm really looking forward to that. And I do hope it happens, because we're in discussions and talking to people about making it happen. But it is, for me, as we move into this digital space, and actually as more artists decide to embrace access, that we start from a policy perspective to define standards. So, in many ways, old-fashioned access worked, but actually as we get more creative about access and it becomes more artistic, we need to also maintain the standards that actually that access is useful to the audience and it is relevant to the audience, because there is no point in creating something that is artistically beautiful and irrelevant or useless to the audience member who, if they are to experience your show, your exhibition, they need that access to work for them. So, a big theme of from access to inclusion the whole way through has been that while we push forward to make things more and more accessible and create more accessible options for people with disabilities, we need to remember that actually it is that audience that we serve, and whatever we do needs to be really useful for them. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Beth, and we're going to be led by her in the Q&A. So thank you very much, and we look forward, as I know the rest of my panelists do, to receiving all your questions.
Thank you all. Such an impressive body of accomplishments, knowledge, and experience. We have a number of good questions from our audience. Let's start with a question for everyone. What steps can we take to open the door for more people with disabilities to work in the cultural access field? Why don't we start with Alicia?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think there's so many ways to consider that question, really. And one I've learned, I guess, in working with IFI and going through my personal experience of acquiring a disability is that to encourage people to work in arts organizations, people with disability to work in them, arts organizations need to be servicing that public. And I think more and more in Ireland, all our arts organizations need to be doing that. It's like a two-way thing. If I go into an organization and see that it has an access program or it responds to access needs of visitors, of guests, of participants, whatever, I'm more engaged in that organization. So I think that is really the first step. That encourages people. If you see an environment that's respectful of you and your situation, then you'll want to get involved in that organization. So I think in a broader art sense in Ireland, there needs to be, like the work of ADI, there needs to be more and more recognition that this isn't just an extra and an add-on and something that we might do occasionally. It's essential. It should be integral to all our organizations. And I think the Arts Council of Ireland, their recent document about diversity and also about access certainly addresses that. And we need to make that kind of documentation, that kind of policy, which Pádraig has mentioned, really central to the very basis of how we all work.
Thank you, Alicia. Ray, would you like to add anything?
Sure, Beth. I think one of the areas of success that I have seen and experienced is by utilizing a cadre of people with disabilities that are the users of the types of things, whether it's museums or cultural arts centers or whatever it may be, to get their input, whether we're doing it right, whether we're reaching out and making the connections that we need to make within the community of people with disabilities, and are the services that we are providing successful to meet their needs. I think it's very important to make sure that we make those connections and that those connections are individuals who are knowledgeable within their particular disability, but also that they are experienced users.
Moana, how about you?
Thanks, Beth. I think I'd just come back to my earlier point around making space and how important that is for all of us working in arts organisations to think about, and asking that question of who's not in the room and why that is. And had a really interesting example recently, offering a disabled artist here a job, and before accepting that position, that artist actually asked whether we had offered that job to a person of colour or a First Nations person, which was really interesting that is something that people are starting to think about. So I guess in making space for disabled people, what would it look like if we started to ask those sorts of questions around this particular demographic group? So yeah, making space and becoming more and more conscious of who's not in the room. And that's, I guess, for people in leadership positions in arts organisations, but all of us working at every level.
And Pádraig, would you like to add something?
Yeah, Beth, I tend, like, I think a lot of the points made by everyone so far are great. I think it's a slow process. I think one of the biggest challenges for people with disabilities in the areas of arts and culture is to go from no job to a full-time job. And actually, so often in the arts, you start with small projects that lead maybe to freelance contracts, that might lead to part-time work, that might lead to work now and again with different organizations, and eventually build up to a point where you might be in a position that's a full-time position. And of course, for people with disabilities, there is that point very often when you're a young person with a disability. At what point do I give up the safety net of benefits, let's say, and what maybe family and community support do I have behind me that facilitates that? And that actually, I think, is a really big issue, which is bigger than ones we can address right now. I suppose from Arts and Disability Ireland's perspective, one of the key things we try and do is we're always trying to spot talent. And so, we would work with artists and people with disabilities, and we will try and create new opportunities for them. Like, we have many artists who are working collaboratively, and we have engaged them as curators through our curated space. We've many artists who have a good social media profile, and we've worked with them to kind of build the work we do on social media, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that you're always trying to spot talent, identify people, and bring them in, because actually each time, and the other thing we always do is, if we bring people to do anything in a freelance capacity, they're always paid. And I think that's a really important thing. So as well as building their kind of portfolio of projects, they're also getting paid. It mightn't be a huge amount of money at the start, but they are getting paid.
Thank you all. Alicia, we have a question. Has your personal experience influenced the content of your programming?
I'd love to be able to answer that. Well, I suppose I don't program the main cinema program in RFI. I'm involved in schools and family, so it would certainly have an impact on that. I try and choose stories for our schools, our youth audience, or family audience that are representative of different groups. But I think maybe the question speaks to something a bit bigger, and it strikes me, I guess, what I've learned over all this, my experience, but also listening to Emmanuel's great keynote earlier, talking about the museum, 9/11 Museum, that programming is really just one aspect, and it's nothing without the rest of the organization. So in terms of accessible programming, which is what we try and do, kind of quickly realized that the program itself, so having films that had captions or audio description, that's only one part of it. The actual whole scenario of the building, the front of house staff, cafe bar staff, the machine, the equipment that was available, the marketing and communications, all of that contributed to actually creating an accessible program. That probably seems really obvious to everybody, but we kind of had to learn that. I think that wasn't just a matter of throwing on a program. It's back to that quote again, actually. If you build it, they won't necessarily come. Or Padraig has mentioned, takes an awful long time. The programming is one thing. So I think I would certainly be aware of, more conscious in programming. But it's within that much bigger context. I'm not sure if that's really an answer, but it strikes me as important to place programming within the bigger picture, I guess. Thanks.
Yeah, well, that's very helpful. Corrig, the question or the comment is, thank you for reminding us that we need to be in this for the long haul. Can you share how policy might support more disabled leaders in cultural access?
Ooh, that's a huge question, and I think it goes back to something that I said at the outset, which is that actually getting the start is very often the biggest challenge, and then being sustainable. I really feel like in all my years in the arts, I don't think we've ever been short of artists with disabilities. There is a great pool of talent out there. However, we have been short of programmers. We have been short of administrative staff, finance people, marketers, people that we don't, that roles that we don't see people with disabilities necessarily in. I can think of 4 people currently in Ireland who identify as being disabled, maybe 5 who are in public role facing roles in the arts sector. There probably are more who don't identify, but I am a huge believer in the fact that we work in that the arts is a career, is a professional career like every other, and therefore we need to develop our skills and knowledge. And I would like to see a situation where we are drawing more people into to study and to work in those areas that support the arts, not just the making of the art.
Thank you, Porg. This is a question for all of us, and it's a really good question. People with disabilities in leadership roles are vital for representation and acting as role models. Do you have any tips for guiding audiences without disabilities through why it's important to represent a lived experience of disability and challenge discrimination? And I'll start with Ray on that one.
That is a good question, and I find it to be a difficult one to answer. I think the issue of discrimination is something that has been around and recognized for quite a long time. And I think as we go through the world change right now of social justice, I actually believe a lot of the lessons that we are learning through that process of, I'll use the word privilege because it exists within the disability field also. But I think it's making sure when we look at the concept of inclusion, that we're also recognizing the fact that discrimination still is taking place and constant education needs to occur. I know going back decades, a lot of it, we had a tendency as people with disabilities to excuse it. But I think right now, rather than excuse it, I think we have to take this opportunity in our current time to educate people so that they recognize when discrimination is taking place, they recognize that that is happening and what measures need to be done to correct it.
I think this is a question we could really delve into for a long time, but we have a few minutes left and one more question, and I think I'll pose that right now. And this again is for everyone. The person says, I've found it useful to shift thinking from accessibility to anti-ableism. This helps to encompass a broader range of considerations, operational and strategic. What are your thoughts on this? Moena, would you like to speak on this?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. It's an interesting word that I think is starting to gain a bit more traction, the word ableism here in Australia, and it's something that certainly some of our key influencers are starting to use more and more in their language. And I suppose, it is an active word. I think it's perhaps a stronger word than accessibility that demands more action of an individual. And I think, we know working in this field that language is really important and the language that we use does have an impact. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting shift to see that getting used more and, anything that inspires and encourages action and is, an active or doing word, I think is useful.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and turn this back to Porg. I invite you to close out this part of the symposium, Porg.
Oh my God, Beth, thank you. And in fact, not just close out this part of the symposium, but the whole symposium. It's been an amazing, what an amazing series of keynotes, panels, workshops, evening events we've had since the 9th of March. In fact, I can't believe we started back then, because we've covered so much ground in such a short space of time. While we haven't been able to count all the figures yet, I can tell you that 435 people joined us for last week's symposium sessions from Ireland, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Portugal, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, Belgium, Singapore and Russia, as well as several other countries that we couldn't quite figure out where they were, but we know that there were other people there from across the globe. If we were at the Kennedy Centre's LEAD conference, as many of us have been in the past, Betty Siegel would be asking us all to stand or raise our hands or both and chant after her, "I am an accessibility asset." It's okay, you don't need to shout at your screen. However, it is worth saying that you are the best resource your organisations have when it comes to implementing access in the arts and cultural sector. And I heard Beth and I think Ray laugh there at the accessibility asset chant, which we have all heard many times. Of the world's population, around 20% are people with disabilities, according to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 30 asserts the right of persons with disabilities to take part on an equal basis with others in cultural life. Essentially, everyone is a rights holder. So although the task is enormous, our collective responsibility is simple. We both, as people with disabilities and non-disabled people, need to continue to work together to make those rights a reality. Betty and myself first seeded the idea of a large international symposium focusing on access in arts and culture as far back as 2016 at ADI's Creative Connections conference in Galway. She assured me then that ADI could deliver, and that confidence has never wavered in the years since, even when we had to make the difficult decision to postpone the original symposium scheduled for Dublin Castle in May 2020. And to this group and to everyone else, I'm really sorry we couldn't bring you to Dublin. We would so love to have, after this evening, sat together and shared a drink and many long conversations. And as I say, that was due to the pandemic. We did have to move online. We continued to have Betty's full support and that of the Kennedy Centre, as well as ADI's board. For that, we are and will always remain very, very grateful. However, while Betty and myself had the seed of an idea, it has taken a whole lot of resources and a team of people to make From Access to Inclusion an Arts and Culture Summit happen. Consequently, I need to thank the following. Our funders, the John F. Kennedy Centre for the Performing Arts, the Arts Council of Ireland, the British Council Ireland Office, and the Creative Europe Desk Ireland. Our sign language interpreters across all the symposium sessions, including Sharon Blodger for ASL interpretation, Sally Gillespie and Christina Laverty for BSL interpretation, and Lisa Harvey for ISL interpretation. our speech to text and cart operator across the symposium, Joanne Petre, and the team at Stage Text. Our conference platform host, EventCube, especially Will Trope and Matt Cowell and their team. Our networking hosts on the text and video chat between symposium sessions, Hannah Goodwin, Roger Adishi, Diane Nutting, Eileen Bagnall, Cleona DeWallish, and Steve Daunt. Our collaborators and co-hosts at the Office of VSA and Accessibility at the Kennedy Centre, Betty Siegel, its director, and her team, Jessica Swanson, Emily Maddox, and Sarah Schwanfelder. And not forgetting the ADI team, Sheila Stewart, who has coordinated the entire symposium, as well as Amy Lawless, Ramona Mulcahy, and our former colleague Leah Johnson, who returned to manage ADI's Twitter handle over the course of the symposium. However, my biggest thank you must go to our 27 presenters and chairs. I promise I'm not going to name them all. And to you, the over 600 people from across the world who have participated in the symposium workshops and evening events since the first keynote on the 9th of March. And so with that, lastly, I want to remind you to come join us for the closing of From Access to Inclusion, a celebration with performances by two talented VSA International Young Soloist musicians, Adrian Antanwanan from Canada and Jose Andre Montano from Bolivia. This Thursday, the 25th of March at 3:30 p.m. GMT. So with that, from Dublin, I wish you all well. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving so much of yourselves to this symposium, and go make access happen around the world. Thank you.
Looped slideshow on backgrounds of warm yellow, vivid sky blue, and soft red. Credits for this event are shared. Each new slide features a large white text box with black text and a bold black outline of a geometric shape, circles, triangles, or parallelograms. First slide on yellow. Text reads, "From Access to Inclusion, an Arts and Culture Summit." Next slide. Text reads, "Thank you. On behalf of Arts and Disability Ireland and the John F. Kennedy Centre for the Performing Arts Office of VSA and Accessibility, thank you for attending From Access to Inclusion, an Arts and Culture Summit." Next slide. Text reads, "Funders and sponsors." The logos of 4 organisations sit below. They are the Kennedy Centre, the Arts Council An Chomhairle Ealaíon, British Council, and Creative Europe Culture. Next slide. Text reads, "Join us in our networking rooms. Meet and mingle with your peers during the break and after the final session of each day." Next slide. Text reads, "Follow us and share," followed by details of hashtags and social media accounts, each typed as one word. Use hashtag #AccessSummit to feature on our lobby Twitter wall. Facebook account Arts and Disability Ireland, Twitter account ADI Arts, and Instagram account Arts and Disability Ireland. Looped slideshow on backgrounds of warm yellow, vivid sky blue, and soft red. Credits for this event are shared. Each new slide features a large white text box with black text and a bold black outline of a geometric shape, circles, triangles or parallelograms. First slide on yellow, text reads, "From Access to Inclusion, an Arts and Culture Summit." Next slide, text reads, "Thank you. On behalf of Arts and Disability Ireland and the John F. Kennedy Centre for the Performing Arts Office of VSA and Accessibility, thank you for attending From Access to Inclusion, an Arts and Culture Summit." Next slide. Text reads, "Funders and sponsors." The logos of 4 organisations sit below. They are the Kennedy Centre, the Arts Council An Chomhairle Ealaíon, British Council and Creative Europe Culture. Next slide. Text reads, "Join us in our networking rooms. Meet and mingle with your peers during the break and after the final session of each day." Next slide. Text reads, "Follow us and share," followed by details of hashtags and social media accounts, each typed as one word. Use hashtag #AccessSummit to feature on our lobby Twitter wall. Facebook account, Arts and Disability Ireland. Twitter account, ADI Arts. And Instagram account, Arts and Disability Ireland.